By the midpoint of World War II, Japanese soldiers had faced many enemies: the British in Burma, the Chinese on the mainland, the Soviets at Nomonhan, and the Americans across the Pacific. But in their private writings and post-war testimonies, one adversary stood apart. Again and again, they mentioned the same name, with a mix of respect and dread: the United States Marines. Captured diaries recovered from fallen soldiers on Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Iwo Jima revealed a striking pattern. Japanese infantrymen, trained to view all enemies as weak and decadent, were shocked by what they encountered in the jungle and on the beaches. One sergeant wrote in late 1942, quote, "These Americans fight like beasts. Even when shot, they crawl forward. Even when surrounded, they do not surrender." End quote. For a nation raised on the Bushido code, where surrender was seen as dishonor, such behavior defied expectation. The Imperial Army's propaganda had painted Americans as soft, lazy, and unprepared for real war, but the Marines who landed on Guadalcanal shattered that illusion. Letters from the front. When the U.S. Marines first landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japanese officers initially assumed they could drive them off within days. The first counterattacks were ferocious, night assaults with bayonets and banzai charges. But after each battle, reports filtered back to higher command. The Marines did not break. A Japanese lieutenant's journal, later translated by U.S. Army intelligence, read, quote, "The enemy dug in like demons. Even when our machine guns struck them, they continued to fire. They do not fear death, or perhaps they do not understand it." End quote. These words, recorded only weeks into the campaign, signaled a profound psychological shift. The Japanese army had long prided itself on discipline and sacrifice, yet they now saw that same spirit mirrored and sometimes surpassed in their opponents. American Marines, trained for island assaults, were specialists in improvisation. They built defenses overnight, turned captured weapons against their attackers, and endured the same hunger and disease that plagued their enemies. To Japanese soldiers used to dominating colonial troops, this was deeply unsettling. Breaking the myth. Before Guadalcanal, Japanese propaganda had assured soldiers that Americans could not fight without luxury or supply. On the front lines, this myth crumbled. Many diaries describe scenes of disbelief as Japanese patrols discovered Marine foxholes stocked with little more than ammunition and water, their occupants still fighting days after being cut off. Private Kiyoshi Watanabe, whose diary was found near the Matacanal River, wrote, quote, "They are not like the Chinese or British. These men shoot accurately. They move fast like hunters. When we attack, they vanish, then strike from behind." End quote. Such encounters began to alter the morale of Japanese troops. Intelligence reports from 1943 noted that some units referred to Marines as sea devils or blue ghosts, a mix of Marine uniform color and the eerie tenacity of their resistance. By late 1943, Japanese soldiers had started to distinguish between Marines and U.S. Army units. They viewed Army troops as competent, but slower to respond. Marines, however, earned a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Inside the Japanese mindset. To understand this fear, one must consider the Imperial Japanese Army training. Soldiers were taught that spiritual strength, seishin, outweighed firepower. They believed that moral superiority and willpower could overcome any material disadvantage. But the Marines disrupted that entire worldview. Not only did they match Japanese discipline with their own, they combined it with overwhelming firepower, artillery coordination, and naval support. To a Japanese infantryman, this was both terrifying and incomprehensible, an enemy that was both fanatically determined and mechanized beyond imagination.
In a captured diary from Tarawa, a Japanese naval officer wrote, "They came through the fire like monsters. Even when our guns cut them down, others stepped over the bodies and advanced. We killed hundreds, yet they kept coming." After the war, former Japanese officers admitted that such experiences deeply shook their confidence. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who served in Okinawa, later reflected that the Marines' combination of precision and aggression was unlike anything they had faced. The American Marine is not reckless. He's patient, but once he attacks, he's like a storm that will not stop. Beyond propaganda. In Japanese training manuals, soldiers were often told that the Americans relied too heavily on machines, tanks, planes, and ships. Marines, however, demonstrated that they could fight just as fiercely at close range. One post-war report by Japanese military historians, compiled for the U.S. occupation authorities, summarized it bluntly. "We underestimated the enemy's fighting spirit. The Marine is a soldier who can live without supply, fight without rest, and kill without hesitation." These were not exaggerations of propaganda. They were confessions from those who had fought them firsthand. By 1944, in places like Saipan and Peleliu, Japanese soldiers would whisper among themselves when the Marines were coming. In many letters recovered later, the same word appeared: Yaban no Teki, the savage enemy. But the word was used with reluctant admiration, not hatred. To many Japanese soldiers, the Marines embodied the same virtues they had been taught to idolize: endurance, discipline, and total devotion to victory. The difference was that the Marines fought for each other, not for an emperor, a distinction that baffled Japanese officers trying to understand their resolve. Captured testimonies. After the early battles in the Solomon Islands, American intelligence officers began collecting the diaries and letters of Japanese fallen soldiers. By 1943, the U.S. Office of War Information and Marine Corps Intelligence had built an entire library of translated materials, each revealing more about how the Japanese perceived their new enemy. Many of the writings were astonishing in their candor. A diary taken from a corporal at Tarawa described his awe after the Marines' amphibious assault. The sea seemed to burn. Their shells fell like rain. Yet out of that fire they came, men in green, shouting, fearless. We shot and shot, but still they came. Another, from Saipan in mid-1944, read simply, "The enemy's courage is beyond reason. They charge through explosions as if they are blind to death. I think they are not human." These weren't isolated accounts. Marine intelligence officers in the field noticed how frequently they encountered similar descriptions. The Japanese seemed to struggle for language to describe what they were seeing: a disciplined, unrelenting enemy that refused to fight by the expected rules. The turning point: Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was the beginning of this new fear. It was there that the myth of Japanese invincibility died, not only in Allied propaganda, but in the minds of Japanese soldiers themselves. The Imperial Army's doctrine had always emphasized offensive spirit, the session that could overcome any obstacle. But on Guadalcanal, the Marines proved that disciplined defense could be just as devastating. They fought with patience, precision, and a kind of methodical brutality that the Japanese command had not anticipated. One Japanese officer, writing during the final weeks of the campaign, admitted, "Our men attack bravely, but the enemy fights with science. They are like craftsmen of death." He described how American artillery, air cover, and logistics worked seamlessly together, while Japanese forces, cut off from supply, dwindled under hunger and disease. The Marines' ability to endure those same conditions, often in silence and with grim determination, left a lasting impression on their adversaries. The evolution of respect. By 1944, Japanese perceptions of the Marines had evolved. Early on, they had been viewed as fierce but reckless, bold to the point of stupidity. But as the war dragged on, that opinion shifted toward respect mixed with dread. Letters from Japanese officers captured in the Marianas Campaign repeatedly mentioned the Marines' coordination and resourcefulness. One wrote, "The Americans have mastered the sea. They're like the tide. They retreat, then return stronger." By Saipan, even Japanese commanders were privately acknowledging that Marine units represented the most formidable segment of the U.S. military. Marine assault divisions were now spearheading nearly every island invasion, and the Japanese High Command began preparing specific countertactics just for them, often to no avail. Colonel Nakagawa Kunio, who commanded Japanese forces on Peleliu, later said in his post-war interviews, "The Marines fought with an intensity that shocked us. They were not content to take a position. They would destroy everything in it. They left nothing alive." Psychological warfare. Part of what unnerved the Japanese soldiers about the Marines was psychological. They expected opponents to fear them, to falter under the threat of banzai charges or close-quarter combat. The Marines didn't. They met ferocity with discipline, and that indifference to fear was something the Japanese rarely encountered. One captured soldier, interrogated on Guam, explained to U.S. officers, "We thought the Marines were men who enjoyed killing. They showed no emotion, no hesitation. That frightened us more than anything." It wasn't that Marines were cruel. Rather, they were calm under conditions that drove most men to panic. Their training emphasized teamwork, survival, and relentless aggression when ordered. To the Japanese, raised in a system that glorified death in service to the emperor, the Marines' motivation seemed alien. The end of the myth. By the final years of the war, the aura of Japanese invincibility was gone, replaced by the grim awareness that the Marines were systematically closing in. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, captured messages revealed that many Japanese defenders expected annihilation, but still feared the fight itself. A final diary, found on Iwo Jima in March 1945, said, "The enemy fights with machines, yes, but their hearts are like iron. We die for the emperor. They fight for each other. Which is stronger? I do not know anymore." That single line, "which is stronger," encapsulated the psychological defeat that had crept into the Japanese ranks. For the first time, they questioned the very code that had sustained them. Reflections after the war. When the war ended, many Japanese veterans wrote candidly about their experiences fighting the U.S. Marines. Some described them as worthy enemies, others as unrelenting hunters. But nearly all acknowledged the same truth, that the Marines' combination of firepower, training, and brotherhood made them uniquely terrifying. In the post-war Japanese self-defense forces' internal histories, one phrase was often repeated: "Against the Marines, every battle was total." Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Imperial Army's most infamous staff officers, summarized it bluntly: "The Marines were not just soldiers, they were professionals of war."
That reputation, born in blood on the beaches of the Pacific, would endure long after the fighting stopped. Even decades later, Japanese historians studying the Pacific War often singled out Marine units as examples of effective modern warfare, an enemy that combined technical mastery with raw determination. Legacy. The words of those who faced them remain some of the most powerful evidence of what made the U.S. Marines distinct. In the diaries of the men who once called them demons, there is a tone not of hatred, but of recognition. "They fought as we were taught to fight," one Japanese officer wrote in 1945, "only better." It's a rare admission, one that captures the essence of the Pacific War's brutality and mutual respect. Behind every battle report and casualty list lies that unspoken truth, that even amid horror, soldiers on both sides could recognize valor in their enemies. And for the Japanese infantrymen of World War II, the sight of a Marine advancing through smoke and chaos would remain an image of both fear and reluctant admiration, a memory of the day when the myth of invincibility met its match. A new kind of soldier. By 1942, as the Pacific War spread from Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Guadalcanal and the reefs of Tarawa, one truth became clear to both sides. The United States Marine Corps was not like any other fighting force in the war. They weren't merely infantrymen in different uniforms. They were the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, a synthesis of land, sea, and air power built around one brutal reality: the amphibious assault. Japanese commanders were stunned by how the Marines fought, but even more by how they prepared to fight. Every Marine rifleman was trained not only to shoot and maneuver, but to think like a combined arms tactician.
From the lowest private to the battalion commander, each understood the timing between naval bombardments, airstrikes, and ground advances. This made them uniquely adaptable, an army designed not to hold land, but to take it back. Training for hell. Before the war, few nations in the world had dedicated troops trained specifically for amphibious warfare. Japan had some naval landing forces, Britain had commandos, but only the U.S. Marines had spent decades refining every element of amphibious invasion, from the design of landing craft to the psychological conditioning of men stepping off them into fire. At Quantico and Parris Island, recruits were drilled endlessly on coordination, movement under fire, and endurance. Instructors broke them down physically and rebuilt them mentally. The phrase, "every Marine a rifleman," wasn't just a slogan, it was the foundation of the Corps' philosophy. No Marine could hide behind a specialty. Whether pilot, radio man, or cook, each was trained to fight and survive under extreme conditions. By contrast, the Imperial Japanese Army, though intensely disciplined, emphasized spiritual toughness over tactical flexibility. Soldiers were told that willpower and courage could overcome material inferiority. Marines were told the opposite. Training beats bravery every time. That difference in philosophy would shape the course of every battle they fought. Discipline and decentralization. One of the greatest contrasts between the Marines and their Japanese opponents was how orders were given and followed. In the Imperial Japanese Army, obedience was absolute. Orders flowed one way, from the top down. Initiative, even when it might save a platoon, was often punished as disobedience. The Marines had learned hard lessons in World War I, where rigid command structures had cost lives. By the 1940s, they practiced what they called distributed initiative. Squad leaders and even individual riflemen were trained to make split-second tactical decisions when cut off or under fire. If a sergeant was killed on the beach, the corporal took command. If the corporal fell, the private stepped forward. The mission, take that ridge, silence that bunker, hold that perimeter, continued no matter who remained standing. This autonomy terrified Japanese soldiers, who often believed that killing officers would paralyze the enemy. When they saw Marines continue to coordinate attacks despite casualties, they realized these weren't ordinary troops bound by hierarchy. They were self-contained units of relentless intent. Fire and movement. Japanese infantry tactics in the early Pacific campaigns revolved around shock and aggression. The doctrine of banzai, meaning human wave assaults meant to overwhelm through courage, was deeply ingrained. Soldiers advanced in tight groups, shouting war cries, their goal being to close in with the enemy for hand-to-hand combat. Marines responded with something cold, clinical, and terrifyingly efficient: fire and maneuver.
This doctrine, developed between the wars, emphasized two teams, one laying down suppressive fire while the other moved forward, leapfrogging toward the target. It was coordinated violence, not chaotic bravery. When the two doctrines collided, mass charge versus methodical advance, the result was often slaughter. At Guadalcanal, Marines learned to keep their lines flexible and their fields of fire interlocked. When Japanese soldiers charged through the jungle screaming, Marines waited until they were close enough to see the whites of their eyes, then unleashed interlocking streams of machine gun fire. Afterward, Japanese survivors wrote with horror about the walls of bullets that cut down entire companies before they could close the distance. Technology and tools. Technology was another frontier where the Marines' approach differed profoundly. They were not necessarily better armed man for man, but their integration of support weapons and logistics was unmatched. Each Marine squad had access to light machine guns, mortars, and coordinated artillery support. The U.S. Navy's dominance at sea meant that Marine assaults were usually preceded by hours, sometimes days, of naval gunfire and air bombardment. To the Japanese, this was unnerving.
Their own doctrine treated bombardment as a prelude to a spiritual contest between soldiers. The Marines treated it as an exact science. If a cave had to be destroyed, they didn't storm it with bayonets, they called for demolitions, flamethrowers, or naval shells the size of small cars. This pragmatic brutality, destroy the enemy, minimize Marine casualties, was alien to the Japanese mindset. It wasn't dishonor, it was efficiency. A captured Japanese officer on Peleliu later confessed during interrogation, quote, "We were taught that pain and sacrifice bring victory. The Americans are taught that machines bring victory. We fought with courage, they fought with calculation. That calculation was precisely why the Marines won." The amphibious ballet. Nowhere was Marine training more evident during the first wave of a landing. Every movement, from the drop of the ramp to the advance across the surf, was timed, rehearsed, and deadly serious. Marines had to carry up to 80 pounds of gear while stepping off amphibious tractors under machine gun fire, wading through chest-deep water, and storming fortified beaches. And yet, within minutes, they'd form organized lines, set up communications, and coordinate fire support. To a Japanese defender watching from the dunes, it looked like madness, men walking into hell without hesitation. But to the Marines, it was choreography. They had drilled for this 1,000 times. One Japanese lieutenant defending Betio Island during the Tarawa invasion later wrote, quote, "We thought the sea would protect us. We did not understand how men could move like that under fire. They came through smoke as if the shells could not touch them." The Marines' ability to execute under pressure became their defining strength. Every man trusted the one next to him, not blind loyalty, but through shared competence. Logistics, the unseen weapon. Behind every Marine advance was a logistics system the Japanese could scarcely comprehend. In the Pacific, terrain dictated everything. Supply lines stretched over thousands of miles of ocean, yet the Marines ensured a continuous flow of ammunition, food, and medical support. Navy Seabees, the Marine engineers, built airstrips, docks, and fortifications in days, turning captured islands into forward bases before the Japanese could regroup. Japanese soldiers often fought until starvation, drinking muddy water and eating insects to survive. Marines fought with hot rations, morphine, and field hospitals set up within hours of landing. A Japanese colonel captured in 1944 summarized it bitterly. Quote, "For us, supply is hope. For the Americans, supply is certainty." That certainty made Marine operations sustainable. They could take an island, hold it, and move on, a pattern of victory that slowly strangled the Japanese defensive perimeter. Adaptability in combat. One of the Marine Corps' most underestimated strengths was adaptability. When tactics failed, they changed them, fast. During the early Guadalcanal operations, Marines realized jungle warfare demanded new movement techniques. They learned to crawl under thick foliage, use grenades in close quarters, and even turn Japanese weapons against their owners. They replaced textbook maneuvers with what they called bush tactics, silent movement, ambush lines, and pre-sighted mortar zones. In contrast, Japanese commanders often clung to doctrine. Even when night attacks failed catastrophically, they repeated them, believing that spirit could compensate for American firepower. Marines learned from every engagement, often conducting after-action critiques even during ongoing campaigns. It was this learning culture, not just bravery, that turned them into the most efficient assault force in the Pacific.
Weapons of the trade. Marines didn't rely on exotic technology, but they mastered what they had. The M1 Garand rifle gave them a crucial edge, semi-automatic fire in an era when most Japanese soldiers still used bolt-action Arasakas. The Browning automatic rifle, BAR, gave each squad its own portable base of fire. Flamethrowers, demolitions, and bazookas gave them answers to entrenched bunkers that Japanese engineers considered impregnable. Every weapon had a purpose, and every Marine knew it intimately. They didn't just use their rifles, they tuned them, cleaned them religiously, and fired until muscle memory replaced thought. Japanese forces often described Marine firepower as continuous thunder. A surviving defender from Iwo Jima recalled, "They never stopped firing. Their rifles, their mortars, their planes, it was like the island was being eaten alive." Morale and brotherhood. Discipline, technology, and logistics were crucial, but the real secret of the Marines was brotherhood. Each Marine unit was small enough for every man to know the others. Bonds formed not through ideology, but through hardship. They didn't fight for abstract causes, they fought for the man beside them. Japanese soldiers were bound by devotion to the emperor, a distant, divine figure. Marines were bound by loyalty to each other. That difference mattered when the noise of battle made orders impossible to hear. As one Marine sergeant wrote home from Peleliu, "You don't think about the flag or the country when the shells come down. You think about keeping your buddies alive." That human connection gave them emotional resilience that ideology couldn't match. The final lesson. By 1945, Japanese commanders fully understood the nightmare the Marines represented. They weren't reckless, they were efficient. They weren't fearless, they were trained. They weren't driven by faith, they were driven by each other. The combination of these traits, professionalism, adaptability, and unity, produced a fighting force unlike anything Japan had encountered before. After the war, Japanese officers studying the U.S. military described the Marines as a perfect balance of mind, machine, and mission. They understood logistics like generals, fought like hunters, and endured like monks. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, one of Okinawa's surviving staff officers, later admitted in his memoirs, "The Marines were the storm. We had no defense against the storm." In the end, the fear that Japanese felt toward the U.S. Marines wasn't simply about strength, it was about inevitability. Every time they fought, the Marines learned. Every time they lost men, they replaced them with better trained recruits. And every island they took became another stepping stone towards Japan itself. The Marines didn't win because they were superhuman, they won because they built a system that turned ordinary men into extraordinary soldiers. And by the time the war neared its end, even Japanese veterans who despised them couldn't deny the truth. They never stopped coming. By the summer of 1944, after the landings in Normandy, German soldiers had a new name for the Americans, the Gods of Thunder. It wasn't because of their tanks or their planes, it was because of the artillery. Across the hedgerows of France, in the forests of the Ardennes, and on the frozen slopes of the Hurtgen Forest, German troops learned to fear the deep, rhythmic thunder that rolled in from miles away. It was the sound of U.S. guns, 105s, 155s, and 8-inch howitzers, speaking with precision and fury. American artillery was not the loudest, nor the biggest, nor the most glamorous arm of the U.S. Army, but it was the deadliest. By the end of the war, over 60% of German combat deaths on the Western Front were caused by artillery. Normandy, baptism by fire. When the Allies landed on June 6, 1944, the Germans were ready for the infantry and tanks, but not for the rain of steel that came with them. Every U.S. division was supported by an enormous network of artillery battalions, each capable of coordinating fire within minutes. Radios, forward observers, and the new M2 fire direction computers meant that American gunners could bring down an entire battalion's worth of shells on a target faster than any other army in history. To German infantrymen, this precision felt supernatural. One veteran from the 352nd Infantry Division wrote after the war, "We feared the Americans' artillery more than their tanks or planes. Their shells came before we even heard the gun. There was no warning, no pattern, just death."
When the Americans broke through the hedgerows in late June, it was their artillery that made it possible. Each advance was choreographed by the guns, walking barrages that crept forward like invisible bulldozers, flattening anything that resisted. German commanders reported units wiped out before they even saw the enemy. Trenches, farmhouses, entire orchards vanished under the bombardment. One officer at Saint-Lô described the U.S. fire as a continuous earthquake. The science of destruction. The real power of U.S. artillery lay not in the number of guns, but in the system that directed them. Unlike the Germans, whose batteries operated semi-independently, the Americans centralized their fire. Using a network of radios and forward observers, they could mass dozens of batteries on a single target within minutes. By 1944, they'd perfected time on target, TOT, a revolutionary firing technique. Gunners calculated the flight time for every shell so that rounds from different batteries at different distances would all land at the same instant. To German troops, it felt like being hit by lightning from every direction at once. A survivor from the 12th SS Panzer Division recalled, "You would hear nothing. Then suddenly the air itself would explode. We thought the Americans had invented a new weapon." At Sanlo, American TOT barrages annihilated entire German battalions in seconds. The shockwave flattened trees, churned soil, and left the survivors deaf and bleeding from the nose. By the time the front reached the Seine, German morale had begun to crack, not from infantry losses, but from the psychological toll of constant bombardment. Hurtgen Forest, the war of mud and fear. In the autumn of 1944, U.S. troops entered the dark, rain-soaked Hurtgen Forest, a nightmare of mud, mines, and trees splintered by shellfire. Here both sides discovered the true horror of modern artillery. The dense canopy trapped airbursts, turning each explosion into a deadly storm of wooden splinters and shrapnel. American gunners, using proximity fuses, a top-secret invention that detonated shells just above the ground, created lethal tree bursts that shredded anything below. German soldiers had no defense against it. Helmets were useless. Foxholes became coffins. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Our soldiers feared the trees more than the enemy. The shells burst in the branches, raining fire. There is nowhere to hide." The Americans suffered terribly in Hurtgen too, but the Germans understood something grim. Even in the mud and chaos, U.S. artillery coordination never faltered. Radio operators kept working under fire. Fire direction centers kept calculating. The guns never stopped. By the time the battle ended, both sides were broken, but the Germans had learned to dread the American ability to summon destruction at will. Battle of the Bulge, Thunder in the Snow. December 1944, the Ardennes. Hitler's last gamble, a massive winter offensive meant to split the Allied lines. In the opening days, thick fog grounded Allied aircraft, and the Germans advanced fast. But then, as the weather cleared, the U.S. guns began to speak again. American artillery was the one constant during the chaos. Divisional, corps, and Army-level guns fired almost non-stop, supplying the kind of support no German unit could match. Ammunition trucks roared across icy roads, feeding the guns like a machine that refused to sleep. When Bastogne was surrounded, artillery kept the 101st Airborne alive. Fire missions were coordinated to the second, sometimes within 200 yards of friendly lines. Forward observers, freezing in the snow, directed fire with icy precision. A German surgeon who fought near Bastogne described it in his post-war interview. "You would hear nothing, then suddenly the air itself would explode. We thought the Americans had invented a new weapon." U.S. gunners often fired until their barrels glowed red, yet accuracy remained stunning. Many historians later noted that during the Bulge, U.S. artillery was the single greatest factor in halting the German advance. Even captured officers admitted it. A report from the U.S. Army's G2 Intelligence Division quotes one German colonel saying, "Your artillery is the best in the world. It comes faster, lasts longer, and kills more than any other." The human element, the artillerymen. Behind the thunder, there were men. Artillery crews lived in constant motion, digging, firing, re-aiming, resupplying. They were engineers, mathematicians, and laborers all at once. The average U.S. gun crew could bring a howitzer from march to fire-ready position in under 4 minutes. In Normandy, they fired so much that some units had to rotate barrels daily. At the Bulge, men froze their hands to steel breech blocks and kept firing anyway. Their secret weapon wasn't the gun itself, it was training. Every U.S. artilleryman was drilled endlessly in gunnery calculations, map reading, and coordination. The result was precision unmatched by any other army in the war. By contrast, German batteries, though skilled, lacked the radio network and centralized control that made the American system so deadly. The U.S. Army's field manual described artillery as the soul of the infantry. The Germans agreed, bitterly. Psychological toll, the sound of dread. Even when shells didn't hit, they dominated the battlefield psychology. German soldiers wrote of the soul-crushing noise that shook their will. They could sometimes withstand aerial bombing. It was over quickly. But artillery went on for hours, even days. It was unpredictable. In the Ardennes, a soldier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division recalled lying in a frozen trench while shells screamed overhead. The ground shook, and I felt it in my teeth. The air was filled with the smell of metal. We prayed for silence. Silence rarely came. U.S. divisions used harassment and interdiction fire, random shelling patterns meant to prevent German rest or movement. Even when the front was quiet, the guns spoke every few minutes, keeping the enemy exhausted and terrified.
The myth of invincible armor. Before the war's end, many German soldiers still believed in the myth of the invincible panzer, thick armor, powerful guns, and disciplined crews. But air power shattered that illusion. The vaunted Tiger I, with its 100 millimeters of frontal armor, could shrug off most tank shells, but it was helpless against rockets or bombs from above. A single near miss could flip it over or destroy its tracks, leaving it stranded and vulnerable. Even minor hits from cannon fire could rupture fuel lines or ignite ammunition. Captured reports from late 1944 described the growing helplessness. We fight the enemy we cannot see. He comes from the sky, strikes, and disappears. We are like rats in a field. Panzer Lehr Division, December 1944. The collapse of Blitzkrieg doctrine. The German military had built its reputation on rapid movement, tanks, trucks, and mechanized infantry advancing in tight coordination. But by 1944-45, this doctrine was obsolete under Allied air dominance. Every daylight movement risked destruction. Convoys traveled at night or under forest cover. Supply routes were constantly bombed. One German general later admitted, "By 1944, every kilometer moved in daylight cost us a tank." This paralysis spread through the entire army. Without fuel or supplies, tanks were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews. The Luftwaffe, once the spear of Blitzkrieg, could no longer protect them. Falaise Pocket, the end of the armored dream. Perhaps the most catastrophic example of this air-ground imbalance came earlier, in the Falaise Pocket of August 1944. As the German 7th Army tried to retreat from Normandy, Allied aircraft pounced. In just a few days, hundreds of tanks, trucks, and guns were obliterated. The roads were so choked with burning vehicles that Allied soldiers later described them as a continuous column of fire. Typhoons claimed dozens of armored kills with rockets and cannons. While post-war studies suggested many vehicles were destroyed by artillery or demolition, to the men on the ground, it made no difference. Death came from the sky. The fear that never left. By 1945, even when Allied planes weren't overhead, German soldiers imagined them there. The psychological toll was immense. Some crews refused to drive during daylight, even when ordered. Others painted camouflage patterns and draped branches over their tanks, desperate to blend with the earth. A veteran of the 116th Panzer Division confessed after the war, "We stopped being hunters, we were prey. The battlefield no longer belonged to tanks, it belonged to planes." The once proud armored divisions that had swept through France in 1940 were now little more than scattered wrecks by 1945. Many were destroyed not in glorious tank battles, but while trying to flee under open skies. Legacy of air dominance. The Allied mastery of tactical air power didn't just win battles, it changed warfare itself. It proved that no amount of armor or firepower could survive without control of the air. The lessons learned over Normandy, Falaise, and the Ardennes shaped the entire post-war doctrine of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Tanks would remain vital, but only as part of an integrated air-ground system. Even German engineers understood this truth in the end. One Luftwaffe officer captured in April 1945 summed it up simply. We built the best tanks in the world, but without the sky, they were just targets.
When the first snow fell over the Russian plains in late 1941, it didn't just mark the turning of the seasons. It marked the moment the German war machine began to die. The Wehrmacht had swept across Europe in a storm of steel, conquering Poland, France, and the Balkans in lightning campaigns that seemed unstoppable. But the Soviet Union was different. It was vast beyond imagination, merciless in weather, and unbroken in spirit. Hitler had promised his generals that the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months. "Kick in the door," he said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Instead, it became the graveyard of the German army. Operation Barbarossa, the beginning of the end. June 22, 1941. At dawn, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. Over 3,000 tanks and 2,500 aircraft roared eastward under the blazing summer sun. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded and annihilated in encirclement battles like Minsk and Smolensk. Prisoners marched west by the hundreds of thousands. The German advance covered hundreds of miles in mere weeks, an achievement unmatched in modern warfare. But in their triumph, the seeds of destruction were already sown. The deeper the Germans pushed into Russia, the longer their supply lines stretched. Trucks broke down, fuel ran short, and spare parts vanished. The roads turned to dust, then to mud, the infamous Rasputitsa when the Russian soil turned to glue. And beyond every captured city lay another, and another, and another. By October 1941, the Wehrmacht reached the gates of Moscow. German officers could see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. Victory seemed near. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, it struck back. The winter that devoured armies. When temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees Celsius, the German army found itself utterly unprepared. Their summer uniforms were useless. Engines froze, lubricants turned solid, rifles jammed. One soldier later wrote, "We froze our breath in our beards. The oil in our guns became ice. We struck matches to warm the bolts before firing." Soviet troops, better equipped for the cold and fighting on home soil, counterattacked with terrifying ferocity. Siberian divisions, trained for winter warfare, poured into the front lines. They wore white camouflage and moved swiftly across the snow, invisible until they struck. By Christmas 1941, the Germans were no longer advancing. They were fighting for survival. A war of annihilation. What made the Eastern Front unlike any other was not just its scale, it was its savagery. From the beginning, Hitler had declared the war against the Soviet Union a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. There would be no mercy, no rules, no limits. Entire villages were burned, civilians were executed. Soviet prisoners of war, millions of them, were starved to death in open fields. But the brutality cut both ways. When the Red Army returned the fire, it showed no pity. Towns taken by Germans in 1941 became killing grounds when retaken by Soviets in 1943. A German soldier wrote in his diary during the retreat from Smolensk, "They come like ghosts screaming from the snow. We shoot until the barrels glow, but they keep coming." The fighting wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The endless cold, the hunger, the sight of comrades frozen where they fell, it all eroded the very will to live. Many soldiers later said the Eastern Front didn't just kill men, it unmade them. Stalingrad, the turning point. In 1942, Hitler made a fatal decision. Instead of retreating to consolidate his forces, he pushed deeper into the Soviet Union towards the oil fields of the Caucasus and towards the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was supposed to be symbolic, a city that bore Stalin's name. But what began as a strategic operation turned into the bloodiest battle in human history. From August 1942 to February 1943, the city became hell on earth. Entire blocks were fought over for days. Snipers hunted each other in the ruins. Buildings changed hands 10 times in a single day.
A German paratrooper wrote home, "You do not fight for meters here. You fight for rooms, for staircases." By November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, encircling 300,000 German troops inside the city. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground. "Not one step back," he commanded. When the airlift failed, the trapped soldiers starved and froze. By the time the 6th Army surrendered in February 1943, 91,000 survivors remained, out of over 300,000. Only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The defeat shouted the myth of German invincibility. The endless retreat. After Stalingrad, the German army never truly recovered. Every step backward was paid for in blood. In 1943, the last great German offensive in the east, the Battle of Kursk, ended in disaster. Over 2,000 tanks clashed in what became the largest armored battle ever fought. The Soviets had prepared for months, laying thousands of mines and building deep defensive belts. When the smoke cleared, Germany's panzer divisions were wrecked beyond repair. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive. The collapse of faith. By 1944, German soldiers no longer fought for victory. They fought to survive long enough to escape the East. The Soviet advance was relentless, across Ukraine, Belarus, and into Poland. Cities once captured at great cost were now abandoned in days. Refugees streamed westward in endless columns, while behind them, the Red Army's artillery thundered like an approaching storm. A soldier of Army Group Center wrote in despair, "We once believed in the Reich. Now we believe only in getting home alive." Entire divisions vanished. Officers who had once spoken of honor now spoke only of endurance. Even veterans of Normandy and Italy admitted later that nothing compared to the Eastern Front. One captured German officer said to his American interrogator, "You do not understand. The West was war, the East was madness." Part 1 Summary. The Eastern Front broke the German army not just through defeat, but through exhaustion, of men, of machines, and of spirit. By the time the Red Army reached the gates of Berlin in 1945, the once proud Wehrmacht was no longer a fighting force. It was a collection of shattered men, haunted by the ghosts of Russia's frozen fields. By the summer of 1944, the German army in the East was living on borrowed time. The veterans who had once marched proudly into Russia now looked like ghosts in torn field coats. The cold, the hunger, the endless retreats, all had hollowed them out. They no longer asked when the war would end. They only asked how. Operation Bagration. The death of Army Group Center. On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets struck back with terrifying precision. It was called Operation Bagration, and it was the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war. The Germans never saw it coming. While their attention was fixed on Normandy, where the Allies had just landed, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers prepared to crush the Central German front in Belarus. At dawn, the artillery began. Thousands of guns fired in unison. The ground shook as if the earth itself were splitting. German trenches vanished under walls of fire. Then came the tanks, waves of T-34s, KV-85s, and IS-2s rolling across fields thick with smoke. Soviet infantry followed close behind, shouting and firing through the chaos. Army Group Center disintegrated in weeks. Entire divisions were surrounded and annihilated. Out of 800,000 German troops, over 400,000 were killed, captured, or missing by July. A captured officer later told his interrogators, "It wasn't a battle. It was an execution." The road to Germany lay open.
The endless flight west. In the wake of Bagration, the Wehrmacht no longer fought in organized lines. It fled, Soldiers stumbled through forests and marshes, hunted by Soviet armor and aircraft. Supply columns burned on the roads. Villages were erased in hours. One German medic recalled, "There was no front anymore, only fleeing men and burning wagons. You could hear the Russians coming like a storm. Their guns never stopped." As the Red Army advanced through Belarus and into Poland, the scale of German collapse stunned even their enemies. Command posts disappeared. Units reported to headquarters that no longer existed. Maps became meaningless. The lines moved faster than they could be drawn. For many German soldiers, the Eastern Front became a single, endless retreat, one that would only end at the gates of Berlin. The Vistula-Oder Offensive, the race to Berlin. By early 1945, the Soviet juggernaut was unstoppable. From the Vistula River in Poland, the Red Army prepared its final thrust toward the German heartland. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet artillery opened fire again, this time with over 40,000 guns. Entire German positions were vaporized in minutes. Within days, Soviet spearheads advanced 300 miles across Poland. Towns like Warsaw and Poznan fell one after another. In just 2 weeks, Soviet forces reached the Oder River, only 40 miles from Berlin. German soldiers who survived Bagration now found themselves defending their own homeland, but their spirit was gone. The once fanatical Wehrmacht now fought simply to delay the inevitable. One officer wrote home, "We are defending ruins with ghosts." The civilians' ordeal. As the front approached Germany's borders, civilians were trapped in the chaos. Millions of refugees fled west, farmers, mothers, children, all running from the Red Army's advance. Trains were packed beyond capacity. Roads were filled with carts, bicycles, and people on foot. Many froze to death in the snow. Others were caught in crossfire or strafed by aircraft. To the east, the Soviets saw these columns as symbols of the destruction the Nazis had inflicted on their homeland. Retribution was coming, and it was merciless. One German woman from East Prussia later said, "The earth itself seemed to take revenge. We heard the guns at night, closer every hour. There was nowhere left to run." Königsberg and East Prussia, the final fortress. East Prussia became a fortress and a trap. Hitler ordered that the territory be held to the last man. The German Fourth Army dug in around the capital, Königsberg, determined to delay the Soviets for as long as possible. But the Red Army surrounded them in January 1945. For months, artillery and airstrikes reduced the city to rubble. Supplies ran out. The wounded froze in their trenches. When Königsberg finally fell in April, its defenders were starving and delirious. Of the 100,000 soldiers trapped there, fewer than half survived. The road to Berlin. By April 1945, the Red Army's advance had turned into a tidal wave. Across the Oder, Soviet engineers built pontoon bridges under heavy fire. German defenders, boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm, tried desperately to hold the line. They were swept aside. Soviet troops poured into Germany's capital from the east, while American and British forces closed in from the west. Berlin became the final battlefield of the Eastern Front, a shattered city of rubble, smoke, and despair. For the Germans, there was nowhere left to retreat. The fall of Berlin. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army began its assault on Berlin. Over 20,000 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, the largest bombardment in history. The city's night sky turned to fire. Soviet tanks advanced street by street, while German defenders fought from cellars and shattered buildings. The fighting was savage, personal, and hopeless. One Red Army veteran later said, "In Stalingrad, we fought for our lives. In Berlin, we fought for revenge." By April 30th, Soviet troops had surrounded the Reich Chancellery. In its underground bunker, Adolf Hitler ended his life as his empire crumbled above him. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. A week later, Nazi Germany was no more. Aftermath: the cost of the Eastern Front. The numbers defy belief.
Between 1941 and 1945, the Eastern Front consumed over 30 million lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Germany lost more men in Russia than on all other fronts combined. The Soviet Union paid an even higher price, over 20 million dead. Entire cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Kiev were reduced to ash. Yet for the German soldiers who survived, the trauma of the East never left them. Many returned home broken, not only by defeat, but by what they had seen and done. A veteran of Army Group North said years later, "The cold, the hunger, the screams, they followed us home. The war in the East never ended for us." Why the Eastern Front broke the German army? The Eastern Front wasn't just a campaign, it was the collapse of an entire military ideology. Hitler's dream of conquest had met a reality it couldn't defeat. A land too vast, a people too relentless, and a climate too merciless. The German army entered Russia as conquerors. They left it as survivors. The Eastern Front didn't just end the war for Germany. It ended the myth of invincibility.
Spring 1945. The Third Reich was dying, though not yet dead. Its armies were shattered, its cities burning, its people starving. But Hitler still demanded that Germany fight to the last breath. Across two fronts, east and west, the walls were closing in. And for those still alive, it felt like the world itself was ending. The Western Front, the slow death of the Reich. After the failure of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive had burned itself out. What had begun as a daring winter counterattack in the Ardennes ended as a disaster. The Wehrmacht had thrown its last reserves, SS Panzer divisions, paratroopers, and Hitler Youth units into the frozen forests of Belgium. For a moment, they shocked the Allies, cutting deep into American lines. But by January 1945, the U.S. Army, led by Generals Patton and Bradley, counterattacked with overwhelming force. The Germans were driven back with catastrophic losses. Their fuel was gone, their tanks sat idle, their air force, once the terror of Europe, was a shadow of itself. From that point forward, the war in the West became a relentless Allied advance across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. Crossing the Rhine, the invasion of Germany. By March 1945, the Allies had reached the banks of the Rhine River, the symbolic and strategic barrier of Germany itself. British, American, and Canadian forces fought through cities like Aachen, Cologne, and Remagen, each reduced to rubble by weeks of bombing and street fighting. On March 7th, American troops made a stunning discovery. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. The Germans had failed to demolish it in time. Within hours, U.S. infantry stormed across under heavy fire, establishing the first Allied bridgehead east of the Rhine. Eisenhower called it the miracle of Remagen. For the German command, it was a sign. The end was inevitable. Germany in ruins. By April, Allied bombers dominated the skies. Cities that had once glowed with industry, Hamburg, Dresden, Munich, Berlin, were now blackened ruins. Trains no longer ran, food convoys were destroyed before reaching their destinations. Civilians hid in basements, emerging only to find their homes gone. One British war correspondent wrote after visiting Cologne, "There is no city anymore, only walls and ghosts." Even loyal Nazis could no longer deny reality. The Reich was collapsing from within. The race to the Elbe. As the Western Allies advanced from the west and the Red Army from the east, a new urgency took hold, not just to defeat Germany, but to decide who would occupy it. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all knew that the armies who took the ground would shape the world after the war. The Cold War's lines were already being drawn in the ashes of the Third Reich. American and British forces pushed towards central Germany with lightning speed. Patton's Third Army raced east through Bavaria, capturing towns faster than maps could be updated. But Eisenhower had a clear order from Washington: stop at the Elbe River and let the Soviets take Berlin. It was a political decision, and a controversial one. Many American generals wanted to beat the Soviets to the German capital,
but Eisenhower feared the cost in lives would be unbearable. Meanwhile, in the east, the red tide approaches. While the Western Allies advanced cautiously, the Red Army was fighting its way toward Berlin with ferocious intensity. The Soviets had paid the highest price of any nation in the war, over 20 million dead, and now they were determined to finish it on their own terms. From the Oder River, Zhukov and Kunev's armies unleashed a storm of artillery and tanks that crushed the last German defenses. The final German units on the Eastern Front, barely more than scattered remnants, fought with desperation born of fear. They knew what awaited them if captured: vengeance for 4 years of atrocities in Russia. Civilians fled west by the millions, hoping to surrender to the Americans instead.
The collapse of the German High Command. Inside Germany's military headquarters, chaos reigned. Communications were collapsing. Hitler issued impossible orders from his underground bunker in Berlin: move phantom divisions, retake lost cities, fight to the death. Many officers knew it was madness, but to disobey meant execution. By April, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring admitted to his staff, "We are not fighting to win. We are fighting to die with discipline." Desertions skyrocketed. Commanders surrendered entire armies rather than sacrifice them for nothing. Encounters between enemies. As the Allied and Soviet lines drew closer, strange scenes unfolded across Germany. American troops liberated concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, uncovering horrors that left even hardened soldiers speechless. In the east, Soviet troops entered towns where civilians raised white flags and begged for mercy. Some received it, many did not. One Red Army officer wrote in his diary, "We have walked through the ruins they left us in Russia. Now we walk through theirs." The death of the Führer. In the final days of April 1945, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin completely. Hitler, trapped in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refused to leave. He still believed rescue was possible, that phantom divisions would arrive, that Steiner's counterattack would save him. But there were no divisions left. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet shells exploded above, Hitler ended his life. His body was carried out of the bunker, doused in petrol, and burned. The empire he had built in 12 years was gone. Germany surrenders. A week later, on May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The next day, May 8th, was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe. In cities across the Allied world, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets. But in Germany, there was only silence. A U.S. intelligence officer wrote that week, "The Germans are not celebrating. They are simply staring into the smoke of their cities." Aftermath. The reckoning. The end of the war didn't mean peace. Not yet. Millions of displaced people wandered the continent. Entire nations had been uprooted. The Nazi leadership faced the Nuremberg trials, and the world confronted the full extent of the Holocaust. In the ruins of Berlin, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag. The war was over, but a new one was beginning: the Cold War. And for the men who had fought from Normandy to Stalingrad, there was no glory, only exhaustion. A German veteran said years later, "We thought the war would make us immortal. It only made us old." What happens after the guns fall silent? The ruins of victory. When the last echoes of artillery faded in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. The victors stood among mountains of rubble, facing a task more complex than any battle: rebuilding civilization itself. In Germany, more than 3.5 million buildings were destroyed. Cities that had once been the centers of culture, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, were now gray deserts of ash. Rail lines were twisted into useless steel, factories gutted, farmland flooded or burned. An American war correspondent arriving in Frankfurt wrote, quote, "It is as if a civilization has been bombed back into the Middle Ages," unquote. But beneath the wreckage, survivors began to crawl out, starving civilians, displaced families, and prisoners freed from camps. They were the living witnesses of the Third Reich's end. The Allied occupation. On May 8th, the guns fell silent, but the world did not immediately heal. The Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, each responsible for stabilizing and governing its sector. Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also split into 4. This would later become the fault line of a new kind of war. American troops in the South focused on humanitarian aid and rebuilding local infrastructure. In contrast, Soviet forces in the East approached occupation as retribution. Entire factories were dismantled and shipped to the USSR as war reparations. Millions of German refugees fled westward to escape Soviet control, transforming towns into sprawling camps of the displaced. The Hungry Years. For the next 2 years, Germany entered what became known as the Hungry Years. The war had destroyed the nation's food supply. Crops were ruined, transportation collapsed, and Allied bombing had wiped out much of the machinery needed for production. By the winter of 1946, rations in the British zone averaged just 1,000 calories per day, less than what Nazi prisoners once received. Black markets flourished. Cigarettes replaced currency. American soldiers often shared their own rations with children. It was one of the first small acts of compassion in a country that, only months before, had been their mortal enemy. Denazification, dismantling an ideology. While hunger gnawed at the body, another battle began, the battle for Germany's soul. The Allies launched a massive program called denazification, an attempt to remove Nazi influence from every aspect of life: government, education, media, and industry. Millions of Germans were interrogated and required to fill out Fragebogen, questionnaires, detailing their involvement with the Nazi Party. Some trials were local, others were monumental. The most famous, the Nuremberg trials, began in November 1945. For the first time in history, leaders of a defeated regime were put on trial not for war, but for crimes against humanity. When the prosecutors showed the films of concentration camps to the court, mountains of corpses, skeletal survivors, gas chambers, even hardened officers wept. A British judge wrote later, quote, "We thought we knew what war was. We were wrong," unquote. The redrawing of Europe. As Germany struggled to survive, the map of Europe was redrawn with trembling hands. The Soviet Union absorbed vast territories: eastern Poland, the Baltic states, parts of Romania, and all of East Germany. Western powers, meanwhile, began to form a new alliance to prevent the spread of communism. The lines drawn at the end of the war would later be called the Iron Curtain, a phrase made famous by Winston Churchill in 1946. Thus, even before the ruins cooled, the next global confrontation was already taking shape. The American presence, a new kind of army. In the American zone, something remarkable happened. Instead of behaving as conquerors, many U.S. soldiers became the first faces of a new democratic Germany. They organized schools, distributed food, and even helped restore local governments. Generals like Lucius D. Clay saw Reconstruction not as mercy, but as strategy, a way to rebuild Europe against future tyranny. Out of this vision came the Marshall Plan in 1948, a massive economic aid program that poured billions of dollars into Europe. It wasn't just charity, it was insurance against chaos and against communism. By the early 1950s, Germany's western half began to recover at astonishing speed, leading to what economists would later call the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle.
In the East, life behind the curtain. But in the Soviet zone, the story was different. Factories were seized, political dissent crushed, and a one-party state slowly emerged under Moscow's control. The German Democratic Republic, GDR, was declared in 1949, with East Berlin as its capital. Thousands of Germans tried to escape to the west, and for a time many succeeded. Families crossed at night through forests and rivers, or hid aboard trains bound for the Allied zones. This would continue until 1961, when the Soviets finally built the Berlin Wall, turning the once shared city into a divided world symbol. The moral reckoning. Even as the Cold War hardened, Germans faced their own reckoning with the past. How had an entire nation followed Hitler? How could millions have remained silent while atrocities occurred? These questions haunted post-war generations. In the first years after surrender, many Germans avoided discussing the war at all. But as the Nuremberg evidence spread, and as survivors began to speak, silence became impossible. By the 1960s, a new generation demanded truth and accountability. They studied what their parents had done, and sometimes what they had ignored. This confrontation with memory became a defining part of Germany's post-war identity. A new order. By 1949, two Germanys existed: the Federal Republic of Germany in the West, democratic, prosperous, and aligned with the US. The German Democratic Republic, GDR, in the East, authoritarian, poor, and under Soviet control. In just 4 years, the nation that had once sought to dominate Europe was now divided by ideology, guarded by tanks, and watched by spies. Yet in this fracture, the modern world was born. The NATO alliance rose in the West, the Warsaw Pact formed in the East. The Cold War began, not with bombs, but with borders. Legacy. The fall of Nazi Germany remains one of the most defining events in human history. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was the death of an idea. From the ashes of Berlin, new nations, new alliances, and new hopes were forged. But the cost was unimaginable. 60 million lives lost, entire cities erased, families scattered forever. When survivors of the war, soldiers and civilians alike, were asked what they remembered most, few spoke of victory. Most spoke of silence. The silence after the gunfire, when the world seemed both saved and broken beyond repair. We thought peace would sound like cheers. It sounded like wind through the ruins. German Civilian Diary, 1945.